On a gray October morning in 2019, every farmer in Pottawatomie County, Kansas, drove past the same field and saw the same thing. A young woman in a college jacket standing at the fence line of her father's wheat ground, watching cattle eat the crop he'd spent 3 weeks planting. Some of them slowed down. A few of them stopped. One of them, a man named Dale Crowley, who had sold more cattle feed in that county than anyone alive, rolled down his window and laughed loud enough that she could hear it from the road. Her name was Willa Hassel. She was 22 years old, and she was about to change how her family farmed forever. Let me tell you about Pottawatomie County in the fall of 2019, because you need to understand the world she was standing in before you can understand what she did in it. This was wheat country. Had been since before anyone currently farming it was born. The county ran roughly 120,000 acres of cropland, and in a normal year, somewhere between 60 and 70,000 of those acres went to winter wheat. Not because anyone sat down and decided it, not because a committee voted on it or an extension agent recommended it, because that's what the ground grew, that's what the elevators bought, and that's what the families who farmed it had always done. Wheat was not a crop in Pottawatomie County. Wheat was an identity. You planted it in September and October, you watched it green up through November, you prayed it through a Kansas winter, and you cut it in June. That was the calendar. That was the rhythm. That was the year. The Hassel family had farmed the same ground for 4 generations. Willa's great-grandfather, August Hassel, had broken sod on the home place in 1931. Not a great year to start farming, but he'd done it anyway, and the ground had stayed in the family through the Depression and the drought years and the farm crisis of the 1980s and every other thing Kansas had thrown at it. By 2019, Willa's father, Gene Hassel, was running 1,800 acres of cropland and a cow-calf operation of about 140 head. Gene was a careful man, methodical. He kept records going back 30 years in a filing cabinet in the mudroom, and he could tell you the yield on any field for any year without looking it up. He planted wheat on roughly 900 acres every fall, ran his cattle on native pasture through the summer, and bought hay and supplement through the winter when the pasture ran out. It was not a glamorous operation. It was a consistent one. In a good year, Gene netted somewhere around $180 per acre on his wheat ground and kept his cattle costs manageable by keeping his herd size matched to what his pasture could carry. He was not getting rich. He was not going broke. He was doing what 4 generations of Hassels had done, holding on. Willa had grown up watching him do it. She'd driven a grain cart at 12, run the combine at 14, and pulled calves in February since she was old enough to stay awake through the night. She knew this operation the way she knew her own hands, but she'd also spent 4 years at Kansas State University studying animal science and agronomy, and in those 4 years she had started to see her father's farm differently. Not worse, not better exactly, just differently. She'd taken a course in her junior year from a professor named Dr. Renata Voss, a range ecologist who had spent 20 years studying grazing systems across the Great Plains, and something in that course had rearranged the furniture in Willa's head in a way she was still sorting out when she drove back to the home place in May of 2019 with her diploma in the back seat of her truck. Let me tell you about what Willa learned from Dr. Voss, because it's the reason this story exists, and it's the reason you're going to understand exactly why Dale Crowley was wrong before he ever opened his mouth. The practice Willa had become interested in was called winter wheat grazing, and it was not, strictly speaking, a new idea. Farmers in the southern plains had been grazing cattle on young wheat in the fall and early winter for decades. The practice had a formal name in the research literature, dual-purpose wheat production, and it had been studied extensively by Oklahoma State University, Kansas State, and Texas A&M going back to the 1970s. The basic principle was straightforward. Winter wheat, planted in September, reaches a vegetative growth stage in October and November where it can support grazing pressure without permanent damage to the stand, provided the cattle are removed before the plant reaches jointing, the point at which the growing point rises above the soil surface and becomes vulnerable to hoof traffic and bite pressure. Remove the cattle before jointing, which in Kansas typically occurs in late February or early March, and the wheat recovers, tillers aggressively, and in most years produces a yield within 5 to 10% of an ungrazed stand. The cattle, meanwhile, gain weight on forage that costs the farmer almost nothing beyond the fence and the management, because the wheat is already planted, already growing, already there. Dr. Voss had walked her class through the Oklahoma State data in detail. Stocker cattle grazing dual-purpose wheat in the fall and winter routinely gained 2 to 2.5 pounds per day on wheat pasture alone, with no supplemental feed required in most years. The cost of gain on wheat pasture, meaning the feed cost per pound of weight added, ran between 12 and 18 cents per pound in the OSU trials, compared to 60 to 90 cents per pound in a conventional feedlot setting. The wheat yield penalty, when grazing was managed correctly and cattle were removed at jointing, averaged 6% across the long-term OSU data set. 6%. On a field yielding 50 bushels per acre, that was 3 bushels. At $5 a bushel, that was $15 per acre in lost wheat revenue. But a stocker steer grazing from October through February, gaining 2 pounds a day for 120 days, added 240 pounds of gain. At a conservative market value of $1.40 per pound of gain, that was $336 of value added per animal, per acre of wheat. Depending on stocking rate, that translated to somewhere between $40 and $90 of additional revenue, even after accounting for the yield penalty and the cost of temporary fencing. Willa had run those numbers on her father's ground. She'd run them carefully, using conservative estimates, using the low end of the gain data, using the high end of the yield penalty. Even with every assumption tilted against her, the math came out the same way every time. Grazing the wheat made more money than not grazing it. Not a little more money. Substantially more money, on an operation that was already stretched thin enough that a bad wheat year meant borrowing against next year's crop. She'd brought the numbers home in a manila folder and set them on the kitchen table in June of 2019. 4 months before Dale Crowley laughed at her from the road. Gene Hassel had looked at the folder the way a man looks at a piece of mail he suspects contains bad news. He was 56 years old and had been farming this ground for 32 years, and nobody in Pottawatomie County grazed their wheat. That was not an exaggeration. In the entire county, with its 60-some thousand acres of winter wheat, the practice was essentially unknown. You planted wheat for grain. You ran cattle on pasture. Those were 2 separate enterprises, and they lived in 2 separate parts of the operation, and they did not overlap. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. Willa walked him through the folder page by page. She showed him the OSU yield trial data. She showed him the gain per day numbers. She showed him her own calculations on the home place's wheat acres and cattle numbers. She showed him what the additional revenue would look like in a year when wheat prices were soft, which was most years. Gene listened to all of it. He asked a few questions about jointing dates, about temporary fencing costs, about whether the wheat really recovered the way the data said it did. Willa answered every question. She had anticipated every question. She'd been anticipating them since March. When she finished, Gene was quiet for a long moment. He picked up the top page and looked at it again, then set it back down. He said, "I need to think about it." His wife, Carol, who had been refilling coffee cups and not saying anything, looked at Willa across the table and gave a small nod that Gene didn't see. That nod meant, "You're right, you know." It also meant, "Give him time." Gene thought about it through July. He thought about it through August while he was prepping ground and ordering seed. In the first week of September, 3 days before he was planning to start planting, he came in from the shop and sat down at the kitchen table and said, "The Hendricks place." The Hendricks place was 160 acres of leased ground on the west side of the operation. Decent ground, but the furthest field from the home place, the one Gene considered most marginal. Plant it the same as always. But if you want to try your grazing on it, you can try it on the Hendricks place. 160 acres. He paused. You manage it. You track everything. And if it goes wrong, we don't do it again. Willa said, "Yes, sir." She did not say anything else. She went out to the shop and started pricing temporary electric fence. Let me tell you about Dale Crowley, because you need to understand who was laughing before you can understand why the laugh mattered. Dale Crowley was 61 years old and had been selling livestock feed and supplements in Pottawatomie County for 33 years. He ran Crowley Farm Supply out of a metal building on the south edge of Westmoreland, and he knew every cattle producer in the county by name, by herd size, and by what they bought. He was not a stupid man. He was in the way of men who have been right about most things for most of their careers, a man who had stopped seriously considering the possibility that he might be wrong. He sat at the same stool at the co-op coffee counter every Tuesday and Thursday morning and held court the way men like him hold court in small towns, with authority and with humor, which are the same thing in a place where everyone already knows what everyone else thinks. Dale's opinion on any farming practice carried weight in Pottawatomie County the way the opinion of a doctor carries weight in a waiting room. People listened, not because they'd tested his conclusions, but because he'd been there longer than most of them and had never been spectacularly wrong. He'd heard about Willa Hassel's plan before October. That was the nature of a county with a few hundred farms and one co-op. He'd heard about it, and his opinion had been delivered at the Tuesday morning counter before Willa had put a single post in the ground. Gene Hassel's girl, he'd said with a kind of tired amusement, came back from college with a plan to graze his wheat. Graze it. 4 generations of Hassels built that place planting wheat and cutting wheat, and she's gonna put cows on it. He'd shaken his head. That's what they teach at K-State now, I guess. But it was in October, on a Tuesday morning, that Dale Crowley drove past the Hendricks place on his way to a delivery and saw the cattle in the wheat field. He slowed down. He looked. He pulled over. And then he called Gene Hassel's number, and when Gene picked up, Dale said, "Gene, you got cattle in your wheat." Gene said, "I know it, Dale." There was a pause. Dale said, "That's intentional?" Gene said, "Willa's running it." Another pause. Then Dale said, Well, and that was all he said to Jean. But on Thursday morning at the co-op, he told the story with enough embellishment to make the table laugh, and the laugh was the kind that carries, the kind that finds its way back to the person it's about through the particular cruelty of small-town acoustics. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. When a man laughs at an idea he hasn't tested, what is he actually protecting? Dale Crowley was not a fool. He could read a yield report. He could do arithmetic. If someone had handed him the OSU data and the gain numbers and the cost of production figures and asked him to evaluate them as a business proposition, he might have reached the same conclusion Willa reached. But nobody handed him the data. The data came attached to a 22-year-old woman who had been farming this county for exactly 5 months since graduation, and it came in the form of a proposal that contradicted 33 years of his professional experience and the inherited practice of every serious farmer he knew. The laugh was not a conclusion. The laugh was a reflex, and like most reflexes, it told you more about the person having it than about the thing that triggered it. Willa heard about the co-op conversation. She heard about it from her mother, who heard about it from Janet Sievert, whose husband farmed 2 sections east of the Hendricks place. Willa was out checking fence when Carol told her. She stood there with a fence tester in her hand and listened to the whole story. Then she said, "Okay." She went back to checking fence. "Let me tell you about the fall of 2019, because that's where the proof started." Willa had purchased 40 head of stocker steers in late September. Yearlings, averaging 650 pounds, bought at a sale barn in Riley County at $1.22 per pound. She'd put them on the Hendricks place in the first week of October, when the wheat had enough growth to support grazing without pulling plants from the ground. She had divided the 160 acres into 4 paddocks using temporary electric fence and was rotating the cattle through them on a schedule designed to keep the wheat from being grazed below 3 inches, the threshold below which recovery slows. She was weighing 3 steers from the group every 2 weeks on a portable scale she'd borrowed from the county extension office, and she was recording every number in a spiral notebook that she kept on the seat of her truck. The wheat looked to anyone driving past like it was being destroyed. That was the honest truth of it. A field of young wheat that has been grazed looks rough. It looks bitten and trampled and sorry. Jean drove out to the Hendricks place in November and stood at the fence for a long time without saying anything. Willa stood next to him and let him look. Finally he said, "It'll come back?" She said, "Yes, sir," before jointing. He nodded once and drove back to the home place. He did not say anything else about it that fall. The cattle, meanwhile, were doing exactly what the data said they would do. Willa's bi-weekly weigh samples showed average daily gains running between 2.1 and 2.4 pounds per day through October and November, with no supplemental feed beyond a protein tub and free choice minerals. The wheat was high in protein and energy in its vegetative state, higher than most harvested forages, and the cattle were converting it efficiently. By the 1st of December, her sample steers had added an average of 67 pounds since turnout. She wrote the numbers down and did not show them to anyone yet. In January, she pulled the cattle off the Hendricks place. The wheat had not yet reached jointing. She'd been watching it carefully, getting down on her knees in the field every week to check the growing point. And she moved the steers to a small dry lot she'd set up near the home place barn, where she fed them hay and a modest grain supplement to carry them through until spring. The wheat field looked in January like it had been through something. But Willa had seen the OSU photographs of grazed wheat fields in January and February and she knew what they looked like in May. The rest of Pottawatomie County planted wheat that fall the way it always had, grazed nothing, and waited for June. Let me tell you about the spring of 2020 because that's when the first number came in. The Hendricks place came out of dormancy in March, looking to Willa's eye, exactly like the research said it would. The wheat tillered aggressively through April. The grazing pressure in the fall had actually stimulated tillering, which is the process by which a wheat plant produces additional stems, each of which can carry a head of grain. By the 1st of May, Jean walked the field with Willa and did not say anything for a long time. The stand was even. The color was good. There were no bare patches worth mentioning. Jean crouched down and looked at the heads forming on the tillers, and then stood back up and said, "Huh." That was all he said. They cut the Hendricks place in the second week of June. The yield came in at 47 bushels per acre. The county average that year was 49 bushels per acre. The yield penalty on the grazed field was 2 bushels per acre, 4% below the long-term OSU average of 6%. At the June wheat price of $4.85 per bushel, that was $9.70 per acre in lost grain revenue. Willa wrote that number down. Then she wrote down the other numbers. Her 40 steers had been on the wheat for 98 days before she moved them to the dry lot. Average daily gain across the group, calculated from the final weigh before removal, was 2.18 pounds per day. Total gain per head, 213 pounds. She sold the steers in April after a further 60 days in the dry lot on hay and supplement at an average finished weight of 942 pounds and a price of $1.31 per pound. Her total cost of production per steer, purchase price, wheat pasture fencing amortized over 10 years, dry lot feed, minerals, veterinary costs, came to $865 per head. Her gross revenue per head was $1,234. Net profit per steer, $369. 40 steers, $14,760 of net profit from the grazing enterprise alone, spread across 160 acres of wheat. That was $92 per acre of additional net revenue, minus the $9.70 per acre yield penalty, for a net gain of $82.30 per acre compared to running the wheat as a grain-only crop. On 160 acres, that was $13,168 of additional profit that had not existed the year before. She set her notebook on the kitchen table and showed it to Jean. He read every line. He read it twice. He set the notebook down and looked at the wall for a moment. Then he said, "How many acres do you want next year?" She said, "All of them." He said, "Not all of them." He thought for a moment. 400. She said, "Yes, sir." Carol refilled Jean's coffee and looked at Willa and did not say anything, but her eyes said everything that needed saying. Let me tell you about what happened at the co-op that fall, because the story doesn't stay on the Hassel farm. Willa had started talking to the Pottawatomie County Extension agent, a woman named Patrice Jensen, in the spring of 2020. Jensen had been watching the Hendricks Place experiment with professional interest and had asked Willa to present her first-year data at the fall extension meeting in October. Willa said yes. She put together a 2-page summary of her numbers: cost of production, gain data, yield comparison, net revenue per acre. And she drove to the community center in Westmoreland on a Tuesday night and stood in front of 43 farmers and laid it out. Dale Crowley was in the room. He sat in the third row with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular way of a man who has already decided what he thinks. Willa had known he would be there. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, by knowing her numbers better than anyone in the room could challenge them. She went through the data methodically. She showed the yield comparison. She showed the gain per day numbers. She showed the net revenue calculation. She showed the OSU long-term data alongside her own first-year results. When she finished, she asked if there were questions. Dale Crowley uncrossed his arms and leaned forward and said, "1 year of data on 160 acres isn't a system. It's a lucky guess." He said it without particular hostility. The way a man says something he believes is obviously true. You got good wheat weather in the spring. You got decent calf prices in April. You had a narrow window and you got through it. That's not a repeatable practice. That's a good year. Willa looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You're right that 1 year isn't a system. That's why I showed you 50 years of Oklahoma State data alongside it." She paused. "But I'd be happy to show you the numbers again next year, and the year after that." The room was quiet. Dale Crowley leaned back and crossed his arms again. He did not say anything else. Patrice Jensen thanked Willa and moved to the next agenda item, and Willa sat down and looked at her notebook and wrote the date at the top of a new page. 3 farmers came up to her afterward and asked questions. She gave them the OSU Extension publication and her own 1-pager and told them to call her if they wanted to talk through the fencing setup. 2 of them called within the week. Let me tell you about the year 2021, because that's when the argument got harder to make and Willa made it anyway. Jean had given her 400 acres for the 2020 to 2021 wheat season. She'd purchased 110 stocker steers in September of 2020 and put them across 4 fields, managing the rotation with the same system she'd used on the Hendricks place. The fall was dry, drier than 2019, and the wheat came up thin in 2 of the 4 fields. Willa adjusted her stocking rate down in those fields, pulling cattle earlier than she'd planned and accepting a lower grazing day total. It was the kind of in-season decision that required judgment and knowledge of the specific fields, and she made it without hesitation because she had been watching those fields her whole life, and she knew how they behaved in a dry fall. The spring of 2021 was better. Adequate moisture in March and April, and the wheat responded. Final yields across her 4 grazed fields averaged 44 bushels per acre against a county average of 46. Yield penalty, 4.3%. Her steers had averaged 2.09 pounds per day of gain over the grazing period, slightly below 2019, but within the expected range for a drier year. Net revenue from the grazing enterprise spread across 400 acres, $74 per acre above the grain-only baseline. Total additional profit, $29,600. 2 years, 2 data points, $82 per acre in year 1, $74 per acre in year 2. The numbers were not identical because farming is not identical from year to year, but they were consistent in the way that matters. They were both positive, both substantial, and both derived from the same principle applied to the same ground with the same careful management. Dale Crowley had not been to the extension meeting in 2021. Willa presented her second-year data to a room of 51 farmers, 8 of whom had tried some version of the practice on their own ground that year. She knew this because Patrice Jensen had told her, and because 3 of them had called Willa during the season with questions about stocking rates and joint and timing and temporary fence setup. She had answered every call. She had driven out to 2 of their farms to look at their fields with them. She did not charge anything for this. She did not think of it as charity. She thought of it as what you do when you know something useful and someone needs to know it. Let me tell you about the summer of 2022, because that's when Kansas stopped being theoretical. The drought had been building since the previous fall. Anyone paying attention to the soil moisture maps in October and November of 2021 could see what was coming. But paying attention to soil moisture maps in October is not something that changes what most farmers do in October, because the wheat is already planted and the decisions are already made, and hope is a legitimate farm management tool in the absence of better options. By February of 2022, the winter wheat across the central and western Kansas had gone into dormancy on subsoil moisture reserves that were already depleted, and when March came without meaningful rain, the crop did not wake up the way it should have. By May, the situation in Pottawatomie County was serious. Gene walked his wheat fields in the second week of May and came back to the house looking like a man who has received bad news he was already expecting. The wheat was thin. It had tillered poorly. The heads that had formed were small. He sat at the kitchen table and said, "It's going to be a short crop." Willa was sitting across from him with her notebook open. She said, "I know." She'd been watching it since March. The drought of 2022 was not the worst Kansas had seen, but it was bad enough. When the county yields came in that June, the Pottawatomie County average was 31 bushels per acre, 37% below the 5-year average. At $7.20 per bushel, prices had risen significantly with the global supply disruptions of that year. The revenue per acre on a 31-bushel crop was $223, against a cost of production for wheat in Kansas running roughly $180 to $200 per acre in 2022. That left most grain-only wheat farmers in the county with a margin between nothing and $40 per acre. Some of them, on their higher-cost ground, lost money outright. Now, let me tell you what happened on Willa Hassel's fields, because this is the part of the story that the numbers tell better than anything else can. Willa had grazed 520 acres of the Hassel operations wheat in the fall and winter of 2021 to 2022. She had purchased 140 stocker steers in September and managed them across 5 fields through November, December, and into January. The drought had been evident by December. The wheat was not growing as fast as it had in previous years, and she had responded by reducing her stocking rate in January, pulling cattle off 2 of her 5 fields earlier than planned and moving them to the dry lot. This was the key decision, and it was a decision that required exactly the kind of judgment that does not appear in any data table. The judgment to recognize that the wheat was under stress and to remove the grazing pressure before the stress became damage. Willa made that call on a Tuesday in January, standing in a field with the wind cutting across the flat ground from the northwest, looking at the color of the wheat and the state of the growing points and the moisture in the soil around the roots. She made it without calling anyone. She drove back to the home place and moved the steers. The drought continued through spring. Willa's grazed fields yielded 29 bushels per acre in June, 2 bushels below the county average of 31, a yield penalty of 6.5%, which was right at the long-term OSU average and slightly higher than her previous 2 years. The drought had cost her some yield, just as it had cost everyone yield. But here is where the numbers diverge from the county narrative. Willa's 140 steers had grazed for an average of 84 days before she began pulling them off the drought-stressed fields, shorter than her previous 2 seasons, but still meaningful. Average daily gain across the group was 1.94 pounds per day, below her previous years, but still positive. She had sold the steers in April at an average of 918 pounds at $1.38 per pound. Her cost of production per head was $871, slightly higher than previous years due to additional dry lot feeding time. Net profit per steer, $396, actually higher than her previous years because the spring cattle market was strong. Total grazing enterprise profit, $55,440, spread across 520 acres, $107 per acre of additional revenue from the grazing enterprise. Against a wheat-only margin of somewhere between $0 and $40 per acre for her neighbors, Willa Hassel's operation had generated $107 per acre from the grazing enterprise, plus $209 per acre from the wheat grain, for a total of $316 per acre on her dual-purpose ground. The yield penalty in the drought year had cost her $14.40 per acre in grain revenue. The grazing enterprise had returned $107 per acre. She was ahead by $92.60 per acre compared to grain only, in the worst drought year the county had seen in a decade. She wrote every number in the notebook. Then she called Patrice Jensen and said she had her third-year data ready. Gene Hassel heard the full accounting at the kitchen table in July. He sat with the notebook in front of him for a long time. He was a man who did not say things he didn't mean, and he did not say things quickly. He looked at the numbers for the drought year, and then he looked at Willa and he said, "You were right." He said it the way a man says something that costs him something, not because he was ashamed of having doubted, but because he understood the weight of what he was acknowledging. Then he said, "You decide the rotation from here on out." He picked up his coffee and went back out to the shop. Carol watched him go. Then she looked at Willa and said, "He told your Uncle Harold about it last week. Said you'd figured something out he hadn't." Willa looked at her mother. Carol said, "That's the highest compliment your father gives anyone." Willa looked back down at the notebook and did not say anything, but she stayed at the table for a long time after her mother left the kitchen. Let me tell you about the October extension meeting of 2022, because that's where the county caught up to what one farm had already proven. Patrice Jensen had advertised the fall meeting differently that year. Instead of the usual notice in the county newsletter, she'd called the meeting Drought Year Results, What Worked and What Didn't in Pottawatomie County. 87 farmers showed up. That was more than double the usual attendance. They came because the drought had been bad enough that people were genuinely looking for answers, and answers were not something that the standard playbook had provided. Willa presented her 3-year data set. She went through each year's numbers, 2020, 2021, 2022, and she showed the yield comparisons and the gain data and the net revenue calculations and the drought year side by side with the county average. She showed what the practice had returned in a good year, in a mediocre year, and in a drought year. She showed that in all 3 years, the dual-purpose system had outperformed the grain-only baseline, and that the margin had been largest in the worst year. She explained why, because the cattle had generated revenue from the wheat's vegetative growth before the drought had a chance to destroy the grain yield, and because the early removal decision had protected the stand from additional stress during the critical spring growth period. The room was quiet in a different way than it had been in previous years. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for a speaker to finish, the working quiet of people doing arithmetic in their heads. Dale Crowley was in the room. He was sitting in the back this time, not the third row. Willa had not looked for him when she walked in, but she'd seen him when she was setting up her materials. He was sitting with his arms not crossed, which was different from before, and he was looking at the screen where her numbers were projected with an expression that was not quite readable from the front of the room. After the meeting, most people stayed to talk. Farmers clustered around Willa with questions about stocking rates and fencing costs and jointing timing and where to source stocker steers and whether the practice worked on sandy ground as well as on heavier soils. She answered every question. She was still answering questions 45 minutes after the formal meeting ended. Dale Crowley waited until the room had mostly cleared. Then he walked to the front and stood in front of the table where Willa was stacking her papers. He was a big man, and he stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked at the floor for a moment before he looked at her. He said, "I've got a customer. Runs 200 head of stockers every winter. Buys a lot of supplement from me." He paused. "He's been asking me about the wheat grazing thing. I didn't have good answers for him." Another pause. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk to him." Willa looked at Dale Crowley. She looked at him for long enough that he shifted his weight. Then she said, "You told Jean's girl that grazing wheat was a lucky guess." She said it without heat, as a statement of fact. Dale's jaw tightened. He said, "I know what I said." She said, "The lesson isn't that grazing wheat is always the right answer. The lesson is that any operation running only one enterprise is one bad year away from a crisis. The drought didn't hurt us the way it hurt everyone else, because we weren't dependent on one thing to go right." She picked up her notebook from the table. "I'll talk to your customer. Have him call the extension office and set something up with Patrice." She picked up her materials and walked out. Dale Crowley stood at the front of the empty room for a moment. Then he put his hands back in his jacket pockets and walked out after her. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story doesn't end in that community center. By the fall of 2023, 14 farms in Pottawatomie County were running some version of the dual-purpose wheat system. Not all of them were doing it the way Willa did it. Some were grazing fewer acres, some were using their own cow-calf pairs instead of stocker steers. Some were experimenting with different stocking rates and rotation schedules. Patrice Jensen had written a county-specific extension bulletin based on Willa's data and the results from the other farms, and it had been requested by extension offices in 3 neighboring counties. The Kansas State Agronomy Department had reached out to Willa about participating in a formal research trial on the practice across multiple counties in the eastern part of the state. She had said yes. Gene Hassel had expanded the grazing operation to 680 acres by 2023. He had also, quietly, reduced his purchased hay budget by 30%, because the cattle were covering more of their nutritional needs from the wheat pasture in fall and early winter, and arriving at the dry lot in better condition than they had in previous years, which meant they needed less supplement to maintain condition through the rest of the winter. The economics of the cattle operation had improved in ways that were harder to capture in a single number, but were visible in the annual profit and loss statement, in ways that Gene understood without needing Willa to explain them. Dale Crowley had sent 3 customers to Willa for consultation. He had not apologized exactly, but he had stopped holding court on the subject at the Tuesday morning co-op counter which in Pottawatomie County was its own kind of acknowledgement. In the spring of 2024, Willa was invited to speak at the Kansas Association of Wheat Growers' annual meeting in Salina. She drove up on a Thursday morning in Jean's truck. She'd borrowed it because her own truck was in for brakes, and she stood at a podium in front of 340 wheat farmers from across the state and walked through 4 years of data from the Hassel Farm and the 14 other Pottawatomie County operations that had adopted the system. She showed the per-acre revenue comparisons. She showed the drought year data. She showed what happened to operations that had diversified their revenue stream versus operations that had not when the 2022 drought hit. She showed the numbers quietly and without drama, the way numbers deserve to be shown, and she let the arithmetic make the argument she didn't need to make herself. Gene Hassel was in the audience. He had driven up separately, which Willa had not known he was going to do. She saw him when she was about halfway through her presentation, sitting in the 4th row with his seed cap in his hands, and she lost her place for just a moment before she found it again. When she finished and the room applauded, Gene Hassel stood up. He was not a man who stood at things like this. He stood, and the people around him who didn't know who he was looked at him briefly, and then looked back at the front of the room, and he stood there until the applause was done, and Willa looked out at the room and saw him standing, and then he sat back down and put his cap back on and looked at the floor in the way of a man who has just done something that embarrassed him slightly and that he would do again without hesitation. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story has one more turn in it that matters. In the fall of 2024, Willa's younger brother, Cody, came back to the home place after 2 years working on a ranch in the Flint Hills. Cody was 20 years old and had spent those 2 years thinking about grass and cattle in the way that young men think about things when they're away from home and have time to read and observe and compare. He came home in September and helped with the wheat planting, and then, at the kitchen table one evening, he put a folder down in front of Willa and Jean and said he'd been reading about mob grazing, ultra-high-density, short-duration grazing using temporary electric fence to move cattle through paddocks as small as a quarter acre, with long rest periods between grazings. The research, he said, showed significant improvements in soil organic matter, water infiltration, and perennial grass productivity over time. He'd been looking at whether it could work on the Hassel native pasture ground as a complement to what Willa was doing on the wheat acres. Gene looked at the folder. He looked at Willa. Willa looked at the folder. She looked at Cody. She thought about a gray October morning in 2019, and a man laughing from a truck window and a kitchen table and a manila folder, and a father who said, "I need to think about it," and a father who later said, "You decide the rotation." She thought about what it had cost her to be right, and what it would have cost the farm if she'd been wrong, and what it had cost the farm when nobody had been willing to try. She thought about all of that in the space of about 4 seconds. Then she said, "Show me the data." Cody pushed the folder across the table. Gene picked up his coffee, and the kitchen went on being a kitchen in the way that kitchens do when the important things have already been decided and everyone at the table knows it. Willa Hassel still farms the home place in Pottawatomie County. The spiral notebook from 2019 sits on a shelf in the mudroom, next to Gene's 30 years of yield records in their filing cabinet. She has started a new notebook. The first page has the mob grazing data and Cody's calculations on the native pasture ground, and at the top of the page, in her handwriting, it says the date and the acreage, and the question she is trying to answer. She keeps the notebook on the seat of her truck the way she always has. The County Extension Bulletin has been downloaded 4,400 times. 14 farms in Pottawatomie County run the dual-purpose system. 3 neighboring counties have started their own trials. The Kansas State Research Project is in its second year. Dale Crowley's customer, the one who ran 200 stocker steers, grazed wheat for the first time in the fall of 2023. His steers gained 2.2 pounds per day. He called Willa in December to tell her. She said she was glad to hear it. She planted wheat in a wheat county. They laughed. The drought came. The wheat died. Her cattle were the fattest in the county, and her fields were the only ones that paid their way. The notebook said, "Try something different." The ground didn't argue, and the farm that was built to hold on found out it had been built to do more than that all along.